I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired and sick and down and out and over the top and overboard and overwhelmed. I just want to be overjoyed, not overworked and underpaid. And I'm not asking to be worshiped or praised, just notice for days of paying my dues, not abused, bruised, and subject to having my tools misused. I don't intend to be misinformed or out of line or disrespected throughout my time or disenfranchised because my line of blood runs deep in burnt bronzes and browns, hues of chocolates and caramels and beiges and yellows and reds, and stereotyped because the hair on my head is woolly and thick and coarse and nappy and dreaded and perm and pressed and locked, not stopped because the color of my skin doesn't blend with white corporate America. Living comfortably in white houses behind whitewashed white picket fences, this makes no sense. This useless jargon of bargains, of deals and steals, I'm up to my gills in cheap thrills. You want to talk about overkill? Look at the streets of Baltimore. Charleston, Ferguson, they've already started to kill until there's a flood of blood in every neighborhood that's up to no good. I got a question. Should, when backed up in a corner, like a Black Panther with his back against the wall, do you fall to the pressure and strain, or do you fight to maintain composure? Do you go out on a limb or go out of your mind? Because now is the time to defecate or get off the porcelain throne. Because the clone of a clown is still a clown's clone, and a people out of place will never feel at home. You see, black people did not come back from Georgia. A man or woman that had learned that they might be taken south might do anything. A man who had to see his son stand naked before buyers might do anything. These words are taken from The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward Baptiste. This book works to establish a direct connection between the violent history of chattel slavery in the United States and the rise of global capitalism and American supremacy. In the 1780s, Georgia men traveled up from the Deep South to Maryland, the middle ground between slavery and freedom, to purchase enslaved African people to work Southern land. Georgia men would walk their purchased people down in coffles, or chain slave caravans, on Indian trails to South Carolina and Georgia, land recently occupied by the Catawba and Coushatta people. In these coffles, 33 enslaved men and more than 24 women walked together. The men carried more than 1,000 pounds of iron chains. To make this march, the men lined 2 by 2 had to work as one single unit against their own self-interest and preservation. They could walk together but not run. They couldn't hide nor fight back. Resistance was in the mind of every one of the enslaved, but as their hope faded, so did their ability to take risks. Too much risk, not enough reward. Landowners and businessmen had permission from the state, from the society, from the newly established American culture to treat black men and women as less than human. Georgia men had no relationship to these enslaved humans, which meant they had no emotional ties to their bondage and subhuman treatment. Can you feel the rhythm of the feet of those men as they walked dry mile after dry mile? At the time of those Georgia men, the state of Georgia lay claim to 65 million acres that would eventually become Alabama and Mississippi, what was referred to then as the Yazoo Territory, and home to the Chickasaw and Choctaw people. Southern slavers, in order to make more profit from this land that was not living up to its full gold-bearing potential, joined with northern slavers to create a national marketplace for land speculation. These schemes acquired financial backing from northern interests who were publicly against slavery to support the American expansion south and westward through the development of newly acquired southern land. This expansion offered financial reward to the potential revenues of the export of commodities, specifically cotton. The embryonic colonies, north and south, needed the sustenance of enslaved labor in order to grow into adolescence with a sense of financial security. So with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788 came the Three-Fifths Compromise, which rendered the bodies of black men and women and children as less than human, cementing a cultural practice as national policy. This compromise created a disproportionate amount of political power in the hands of Southern white enslavers, ensuring that the South would dominate the presidency for more than 70 years. Our Constitution then laid the foundation for the expansion of slavery by uniting the states behind a quest for unity, prosperity, and dominance through westward expansion. And although the African trade was banned in 1807, the internal trade and transport of enslaved African descendants continued legally until 1865. This is how American democracy was born. And this is why it would be 178 years before Southern blacks would be allowed to cast their own vote. Look around the room. We know there are differences in every human being on the planet, but the idea of different races is a cruel and callous human mythology designed to maintain power through creating a fictitious system of whiteness as normalcy, as universal. And everything else then is abnormal. Categorization and separation is a long-standing tactic of those in power. It produces a real and tangible system that promotes vast inequity and inflicts deep psychological damage on all of us. Both public and private institutions operate within these systems, systems that push difference to the margins in the quest to create a false sense of regular or normal. These systems are bigger than us, and yet they can't run without our complicity. When we comply, we not only marginalize the other, but we render our own uniqueness invisible. I've opened today with Georgia Men because I think it's important to bring our conversations about racial equity in the arts out of the abstract and place them in a social, political, and historical context. We must connect what has happened historically and what is happening today in the streets of Ferguson, North Charleston, Baltimore, New York City, the Bay Area, and even Waco to what is happening on our nation's stages, in black boxes, rehearsal studios, and performance spaces across the nation. They are symbiotic in their relationship to each other. We can't talk about contemporary performance and not talk about both the 24-hour news cycle and social media as purveyors of cultural practice and shapers of public policy. Our nightly news is filled with politics, the politics of governance, of money, the economy, criminal justice, and education. And what is politics but a form of theater? All the elements are there: producers, directors, writers, actors, stage managers, designers, press, and promotions. Their faux journalism and curatorial algorithms reinforce historic stereotypes, creating powerful works of fiction that fixate the public on the precarious edge of fear and safety. It is scripted with intention, with through lines and narrative, building on classic archetypes. It is performance propaganda put forth by the perversely rich and political elite. Spectacle on the grandest scale. By putting these makers outside of the framework of artists, we give ourselves very little space to critique their practice and their discipline. So let's connect this idea of the great play to Baptiste's book In the Streets of Baltimore, because it's absolutely essential to understand that then, in the 1700s, as today, the lives of poor, too often black and brown, young men and women are still expendable. That is fact. Yet when this history is addressed in the media, it shows up as fodder for fear, as food for a culture addicted to violence. Why? Because the premise behind the 3/5 compromise cemented the idea of second-class citizenship so deeply in our cultural psyche and institutional policies that we can no longer see it or feel it, and thus we deny its very presence. The uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson are people demanding that they be seen, be heard, clearly saying, "We are human." Their performance in the streets is a contagious renegotiation of public space as a compounded response to generations of systemic oppression. This response should inform the way we push for change in the institutions of philanthropy. Our responses have to be systemic, intentional programming informed by strategic policymaking. We are at a critical point of opportunity and risk as a society. We are in the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a true 20th century artist. No one was more adept in their understanding of the Southern oral traditions. He was masterful in his use of theater and the elements of production to create dynamic, responsive spaces for demonstration in the form of public spectacle. In the movie Selma, King talks to young brothers in SNCC, basically saying, what we have to do is work on the systemic policy shifts to make a difference in this country, but it's going to take drama on a world stage in order to develop the empathy needed to move people to action and risk their privilege. And the way that he was able to do that was by creating spectacle. King and his comrades designed street theater for a hungry media infrastructure that was just coming into the age of live, on-the-spot reporting. This confluence of tactics and technology played heavily into his ability to shift the consciousness of the country. Who gets a chance to perform on stage? Whose stories get a chance to be told in public space? And who gets to tell those stories? They all impact public perception. And public perception ultimately shapes public policy. King recognized the opportunity of this emerging media machine and took the risk to place his life and the lives of the hopeful on the line in this theater that would show up in the living room of millions of households around the country. So what is the role of arts today? What is the opportunity? And what are we willing to risk, or what are we risking if we continue on the current path? The heart of King's artistry is that he worked to humanize all people. He felt that if you were born from a human womb, then you were born with these inalienable rights. And it's important to recognize King as an artist, because when we place limitations on what we think art is and who we deem worthy of wearing the label of artist, we place restriction on ourselves and confine our understanding of the impervious nature of cultural traditions. We limit our ability to recognize the potential power art has to shape both ideology and perception. I think that Black Lives Matter is the civil and human rights movement of the 21st century. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Rekia Boyd, Walter Scott, Tanisha Anderson, the list of names that have sparked national interest is much too long. The way that social media has made these iterations of state-sponsored violence visible are equivalent to Emmett Till's bloated and deformed body being on the cover of Jet magazine in 1955. Today, we see massive public demonstrations and uprisings that are in response not just to the particular event of the day, but to the systemic and long-term abuse of power. Today, an accident happens overnight. By the afternoon, it has been viewed, shared, and tweeted to millions. By nightfall, there's tens of thousands of people in the street. And not just the streets of the community where the incident happened, but in the streets of communities across the country, and people are standing in solidarity with them across the globe. The gestational period of movement building has shrunk. Ideas can go from formulation to realization in a matter of minutes. Think about how the civil rights movement and the grassroots strategy that had to be employed to ensure that the people who were most affected by injustice informed the nation's education on the issues and had access to the avenues by which they could change and respond. Everything was hand to hand, mouth to ear. From Emmett Till's murder in 1955 to 63, 64, 65, when the Birmingham church was bombed, the murders of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, when protesters were brutalized in Selma marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. These public displays of the rancidness of white supremacy and how it terrorized black communities in the Deep South gave the country an opportunity to bear witness, respond, and react. And it took years of organizing for justice and equality to garner this type of diverse movement moment that was undeniable. Today, the sheer volume of stories of the oppressed that we're able to witness on a broad scale and the speed at which we're able to access them is unprecedented. We're able to see in a very different way than in the 50s and the 60s what was happening on the ground and how the community is responding in real time. Philanthropy has a history of activism. Jane Addams created Hull House in Chicago, and settlement houses sprung up around the country. In New York City, the Henry Street Settlement is almost as well known as an art center as it is for its historic work on the Lower East Side. Margaret Sanger fought and was jailed to bring the idea of birth control and family planning out of the realm of religion and into public consciousness. In rural communities, philanthropy was about collecting and distributing food or holding classes on front porches to teach people to read. Charitable work wasn't done from desks and offices only, but from feet on the ground, knocking on doors and connecting strategic policy making to the needs of the people. Today, philanthropy is well organized, professional, and highly transactional. It is an industry with much of its infrastructure cut off from activist roots. So its view of society's challenges and issues are seen at a removed, in the abstract. But the opportunity for philanthropy to once again get in the mix is here. The issues and challenges are clear, present, and so unavoidable. The question is, how much privilege is philanthropy willing to risk to collectively organize for systemic change? So much of the way that philanthropy responds to systemic issues of inequity is with programs that are intended to help the individual Alana artist to overcome whatever individual barrier has been placed in front of them. And in many cases, the individual can be lifted above the system just long enough to help them see the path through the maze so that they can begin their process of escape. But the barriers remain because the barriers are not individual systems. It's an ecosystem of oppression. In the Atlantic's article, The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, he states that many people of color exist in an ecologically distinct community. The idea is that there is an entirely different ecology in terms of economy, education, health, and legal systems for people of color than there is for white people. What you have is a system that references itself in terms of oppression and compounds that oppression: redlining, higher interest rates, transportation systems, lower pay for people of color, tax-based funding for public education. All of these things reinforce inequity that is systemic, deeply entrenched, and long-standing. The systemic issues of poverty, poor health, sharecropper education, and high unemployment and incarceration rates are not the work of a failed individual or community. But that's how it's often framed. And that's what programs that set out to support Alana individuals and communities are often geared toward. But racial equity is not a philanthropic problem. It's a societal problem. So if you're starting at the very beginning thinking that this is something that needs to be fixed within philanthropy without acknowledging the historic roots of the issues, then you will only create solutions to cover up the symptoms, not cure the sickness. Philanthropy can help work to shift perception and work towards identifying core strategies to improve our collective conditions. But first, we must shift from a practice of dissecting and fragmenting our work into spaces of education, healthcare, human rights, or arts and culture. We must recognize that all of these issues are intrinsically connected and tied to one another. So our role is to understand where it is that we can apply pressure to develop and strengthen existing systems of change. And not just within GIA, but change within a larger societal structure. And yes, it is big and audacious to think about the cultural transformation that has to come about to ensure and achieve true equity. But there's no better time than the moment to take the risk. So what would it look like if we relegated the next 5 generations to working together to challenge systemic oppression, developing new systems and cultural practices? See, the first thing we must do is validate action at every level and recognize that our work is interconnected in an ecosystem of change. The work that you do on the individual, person-to-person level in community is no more or no less valuable than the work that you do when you're talking to your legislators in D.C. All of those pieces are important and integral to building a movement. So you work where you can, but you must first make the decision to work. And you have to make a decision to work towards justice. So by coming to this forum, you've made a decision to engage in conversations around cultural equity with your peers. But the conversation does not stop when you leave this room. It's on you, it's on us to continue to grow together and develop strategies. This is not a feel-good exercise or an opportunity to check the diversity training box for your own professional development. We are here to manifest systemic change, but we must have hope. We must build on our work and the work of others. As such, it's important to acknowledge the giant steps that Grantmakers in the arts have made in demonstrating their commitment to placing cultural equity high on their institutional agenda. It is also important to reference the work of the Arts, Culture, and Social Justice Network, a network that started out as an affinity group of GIA and as such pushed ideas of cultural equity and social justice within GIA on levels of governance and programming. So this is a big deal. We're sitting in this space having a conversation about racial equity and grant making under the banner of Grantmakers in the Arts. It's because of these collective organizing efforts that we're here today. This is an example of institutional transformation that has come about because leaders have validated the work of artists as being integral to change and have stayed committed to advancing a social justice agenda. It is hopeful people that are willing to take risk. What's dangerous is when people succumb to hopelessness. Even when you feel you have nothing to lose, you still might take risk. But if you lose your hope, your propensity to take risk is greatly diminished. So what risks are being taken in the philanthropic sector to support Alana communities? Who among us are championing traditional cultural practices and the innovations of fringe communities as industry standards? Now is the time to take risk and work together to manifest a different tomorrow. Because our work will only become successful when we stop seeing the communities that are struggling to maintain hope as others and begin to see them as extensions of ourselves. But y'all ain't listening. See, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents is like trying to pay your rent when your money's already spent. See, we be wading waist deep in confusion, breathing the illusion of the American dream, but things ain't always what they seem. You see, Martin Luther King's dream was meant to pull us up by the bootstraps, allowing us half a chance of becoming something better than what we were, attempting to clear the pathway of the obstruction of justice so that we could walk a clear road to manifest destiny, hand in hand with murderous, killing backstabbers, money grabbers, and power snatchers, control freaks, freaking out of control, molding each generation to live by past legislation forged to solidify segregation so that this nation would never become one under God, only invisible to liberty and justice for some, and none would be judged by the content of their character, only the complexion of your skin. And to make sure that you can't win, your reflection is demoralized, stigmatized, blemished, soiled, and rendered foul, and all the while you break your back to build a nation that buries facts in stacks of lies. It's time to rise and wipe your eyes of the years of tears of living in fear of the red, white, and blue. Because if I do to you what's been done throughout time to people that look like me, I would never see the outside of the penitentiary. Only front seats of courtrooms and back seats of armored cars and broomstick handles as memorial candles burn for my ancestors. It's time to rise. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on free.